And we're going to start talking about moose. And I know that there's not many people in here that are interested in moose right now. It doesn't seem to be a hot topic for our members these days. But we're actually, there's arguably no hotter topic right now than moose management in Ontario. It's really important to our members. And I think today when we talk about moose, we're going to talk about it from a completely different perspective. We're not going to talk about moose themselves, but we're going to talk about the people who hunt moose, the hunters out there. And so it's a really interesting perspective, because when we talk about fish and wildlife management, we need to think of more than just the fish and wildlife populations themselves. Understanding the resource user is critical for fish and wildlife management. And the OFAH has been a long-time advocate for studies that focus on learning more about anglers and hunters and trappers so that we can better manage our fish and wildlife resources. But over the past decade, our next presenter has focused his research on just this, understanding the behaviors and the preferences of outdoor recreationalists and nature-based tourists. This understanding is critical not only to assess how activities like fishing and hunting impact fish and wildlife populations, but also to assess how participating in these activities directly and indirectly enriches the well-being of Ontario residents. Dr. Len Hunt is a human dimensions of natural resources management research scientist with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry based in Thunder Bay. During today's presentation, Dr. Hunt will draw from 2 surveys of moose hunters that were conducted in 2013 to describe how the survey data provides important insights about moose hunters and how it relates to managing moose in Ontario. This knowledge will be very important to inform the discussions that we have on the future of moose management in Ontario. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Len Hunt.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Matt, for that nice introduction. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about subject matter which is probably a little bit unique compared to what normally you would hear from with the speakers at the AGM. I'm not going to talk about ecology. I'm not going to talk about biology of a game species, in this case, moose. I'm not even going to talk about the details about the way that we manage moose, the policy around moose, or the governance of the activity of moose hunting. What I'm going to do is to provide you with a little bit of insights in terms of the way that we can describe moose hunters. And I'm going to do that through social surveys that have been conducted with licensed resident Ontario moose hunters over the past number of years. Maybe just a quick show of hands. Spring of 2013, there were 2 surveys sent out. One was focused on a Northeast region moose hunter survey, and the other was a provincial moose hunter survey. Anyone in the audience receive a copy of either of those questionnaires? There we go. So I will not ask whether you responded to those questionnaires or not, but my responsibility to you is to provide you with the details, the profile of what we found from those surveys. And for those individuals who did not complete those questionnaires, is to try to show that there is a value in actually completing those questionnaires, and that maybe in the future you'd be more receptive to the idea of responding. So here I was in 2012, sitting back, blissfully unaware of something what was known as the Moose Project. And then I got a call. We need you to help out with a small portion on this Moose Project. And the stress has led to the deterioration that you see today. And just looking out across the audience, I think there's a lot of people that are stressed around moose hunting. Okay. So I'm going to use a little bit of shorthand as I go forward here. I'm going to use the words hunter, moose hunter, and Ontario moose hunter interchangeably to basically mean Ontario resident moose hunter, okay? So just permit me with that shorthand as we go forward. It just saves a lot of words through all the different slides. Two prongs to this presentation that I'm going to provide. One is more of a profile or a description of who are moose hunters, their characteristics, what are some of the characteristics associated with their hunting activities, and what type of economic expenditures associated with the activity of moose hunting. And on the second side, what I'm going to focus about is around harvest strategy options. So different ways to manage moose, and the way that hunters are telling us they would respond in terms of their preferences for those different ways to manage moose, and as well in terms of how they would react were those different harvest strategy options put in place. So that's really the focus that we have today. And I'm going to provide you with that description through 3 different social surveys. So the intro said 2, but I've actually added in a third social survey here. So the one social survey was conducted in spring of 2013. It focused on the 2012 moose hunting season. That's why it shows up 2012 Provincial Moose Hunter Survey. So it was a random stratified sample of 2,700 hunters. This strata that I speak of really focused on where individuals intended to hunt, and it was based on their Choice 1 WMU. The strata related to MNRF regions, so we have Northwest, Northeast, and Southern, and I'm not sure how easy it is to make out from the slide here, and as well what are known as surveyed ecological zones. Okay, and we have a surveyed ecological framework which provides landscape direction in terms of how we should manage surveyed species. And surveyed species are moose, deer, elk, and caribou. So we have, for each combination of MNRF region and surveyed ecological zone, we selected 300 hunters randomly. So there would be 9 in total. We focused on Northwest A, Northwest B, Northwest C1, Northwest D1, Northeast A, Northeast B, Northeast C2, Northeast D2, and Southern D2. We didn't focus on surveyed ecological zone E because there's not a lot of hunting activity that occurs there. So out of the 2,700 people that we contacted, we had a good response rate from them. 73% of the people responded back to us. And a couple other points I want to make before I move on from the slide. Although the results are at the level of this combination of surveyed ecological zone and MNRF region, I'm going to present the results at the MNRF region. If you want details about this particular survey, I do have a few copies of a report that was produced that are available, and I'd appreciate if people take them off my hand so I don't have to bring them back to Thunder Bay. And the final point I want to make before I go on to the next slide is the fact that although people would have identified where they would have liked to have hunted through their Choice 1 WMU, obviously if you're not successful in the draw, your actual hunting activity may occur in a different area. And so what I did was I reassigned people to the region where they actually hunted the most often in 2012. Okay. Second survey, this one I didn't have any fingerprints on. So this was done as part of the end of what was known as the Provincial Mail Survey System. And yes, we are aware of the acronym from Provincial Mail Survey. So this was conducted in 2002, and it focused on the 2001 hunting season. Again, it was focused on a random stratified sample. The strata were represented in terms of where the hunt would occur, and as well the type of draw that the individual had applied to, and whether the individual was successful in that draw. Again, all based off Choice 1 WMU. The response rate was a little bit lower at 58%, and the reason that I bring this survey forward is to really contrast some of the trends that we see in terms of who are moose hunters and how they're changing over time. And the third survey that I want to focus on is a Northeast Region Moose Hunter Survey. So this was conducted for 12 wildlife management units in Northeast Region, corresponding to surveyed ecological zones C2 and D2 in Northeast Region. This is essentially the breadbasket of area where a lot of moose hunting activity occurs. And so our regional wildlife biologist was especially interested in trying to gain some further insights from people hunting in this area as to very specific moose hunter harvest strategy options. And we sent the survey out to 1 in 6 hunters who applied to each of the WMUs. So again, it was a random stratified sample. We also sent the survey out to all individuals who were operating a tourism business in these areas that had a focus on moose hunting activities. You can see that there were 5,000 individuals from the hunting licenses that we had contacted. The response rate to the survey was a little bit under 50% for our hunters and closer to 70% for our tourism operators. All right. So you may have seen this picture before as I lifted it nicely from the OFAH website. We want to talk a little bit about the diversity of hunters. Who are these hunters? Okay. And a lot of this may be well known to you already. So one of the things about moose hunters, it may come to a surprise to you, but moose hunters tend to be males. Okay? So the surveys that we conducted in 2001 and 2012, we have a depiction of the breakdown between males and females by region of the hunt. So people hunting in Northwest region, people hunting in Northeast region, people hunting in Southern region, and then Ontario as a whole. If you look at the orange pie slice, that corresponds to the percentage of respondents who indicated that they were females from the 2001 survey. If you take that orange slice and add to it that white dashed orange slice, that would be the percentage of individuals who were saying they were female in 2012 from our survey. So the one conclusion that you can draw pretty quickly here is that we actually have an increase in the number of women hunters from 2012 to 2001. Okay. Conclusion number 2 from this slide. There is a difference between those individuals hunting in southern region to those individuals hunting in the northern regions. Individuals in the northern regions tend to be more comprised of females than in the south. Okay, why is that? Well, you know, there's a couple different reasons that one could speculate upon, and these are just speculations. The one is that maybe there's a culturally, maybe moose hunting activity is culturally more important to individuals who are in northern Ontario than in southern Ontario, and therefore it becomes more of a community-based hunt. The second, and more cynical response, is that maybe the males in northern Ontario are a little more effective at convincing their female partners to apply to the draw. So you want the glass half empty, half full. All right. So let's talk a little bit about the age of the moose hunters. So we've broken the respondents down into a number of different age categories, from 15 to 18, followed by 10-year increments up to 80 plus. So what do we observe from this slide? Well, if you look at 2012, the majority of moose hunters are between 50 and 69 years of age. Okay? And how does that compare to what we saw in 2001? Well, in 2001, the majority of moose hunters were between 40 and 59 years of age. It's the same group moving through. Okay? So if we start, it's a troubling trend, isn't it? And if you start thinking about predicting how a population may differ in the future, if you try to project out into the future, demographers tell us there's 3 things that you really have to be careful to think about. One is that there's an age effect or a life cycle effect. So the reason that we have so few percentage of individuals who are hunting that are 80 plus is that, you know, there's not as many people around in their 80s, and those people who are around may find it more physically challenging to get out and pursue this type of activity. Sort of the good news is that we actually see an increase in the percentage of hunters that are 80 plus, so that's some good news that I see out here. On the other side, in terms of an aging effect or life cycle effect, is that maybe until one's in their 40s or even into their 50s, they don't have the financial well-being and leisure time availability to pursue an activity like moose hunting, right? So maybe there's an increase in the percentage of hunters in the future as they get a little bit older. So maybe it's not all as bad news. The second effect that demographers talk about is what's known as a cohort effect. It basically means that people that are born about the same time tend to be a lot more like each other than people born at different times, even after you control for the fact of their age. So for example, individuals who are baby boomers grew up at a time where outdoor recreation, hunting, and fishing were norms. Okay? People who have grown up since that time maybe don't have that same connection to nature. And maybe their views are not so conservation-oriented in terms of their environmental values, but they're more preservation-oriented. So there can be differences between those groups. And that's important because as those cohorts move through, it has effects in terms of how that population will look in the future. So I think we see some evidence of a cohort effect, seeing that 40 to 60-year-old group going through in 2001 being the strongest group in 2012. And then the third effect that demographers tell us about is a period effect. It's essentially a point in time that's a game changer for everyone who lived through it. So anyone who lived through 9/11 can attest to the fact that that really reset our thoughts about security and safety. And those people who were born post 9/11 probably have different perspectives than all of us because of that. Okay, so those are the three things to keep in mind. And the reason I bring them up is that it's not easy to just simply look at a slide and say, in the future, there are going to be less moose hunters. There's worrying trends here, but it's a more complicated story than that. And speaking of complicated, I'll put up this slide, which is really complicated. It's trying to look at the relative underrepresentation of each of the different age groups when compared to the Ontario population. Okay? And it's a tough slide to read, but let me try to walk you through an example here. We have this underrepresentation, this relative underrepresentation, which ranges from 1 to 14. So 1 is set sort of as an index, and you can see that the 50 to 59-year-olds in 2001, they're right on that value of 1. If you look at the 2001 bar for 80 plus, you can see it's around 14. So what does that mean? It means in 2001, if you would have taken one individual age 50 to 59 by random and one individual 80 plus by random, there was a 14 times greater chance that the individual that was 50 to 59 would be a moose hunter than the person 80 plus. So it's an indication of the relative strength of that group compared to the Ontario population. So you can see the aging effects again with the 80 plus, and again what I want to point out is in 2012 we see the actual better balancing in terms of representation. But the worrying element is on the left side of the graph. So the younger age groups tend to be underrepresented from the population, and even the worrying trend is that for the 40 to 49-year-olds and 30 to 39-year-olds and 15 to 18-year-olds, it seems like the underrepresentation is getting worse. Okay? So that's a troubling fact when it comes to the moose hunting side. So after that wonderful news, we can go on and start to describe some other aspects about moose hunters. So another thing that may come as a surprise to you all is that not everyone who applies to the draw, not everyone who buys a license actually hunts in a given year. So our best estimate is that the percentage of licensed moose hunters hunting in any given year ranges somewhere between 83 and 91%. There's a lot of people that, because they're unsuccessful in the draw, decide that they're not going to pursue the activity that year. All right, so let's talk a little bit about details around the hunt. So this graph describes the average number of days that respondents reported hunting when they focus their hunt in NW, Northwest region, NE, Northeast region, or Southern Ontario S. So what do we, and the boxes around these estimates are really just an idea of the confidence around the average estimate. So if you look at the Northwest and Northeast in 2001, the average days hunted was around 10. And if you look in 2012, the average days hunted for those groups is about 10. So it's stayed pretty constant over that time. And you can see in Southern Ontario, obviously with the 6-day gun hunt, the numbers sort of has a constraint on the ceiling. It's at about 5.5 for both 2001 and 2012. Now the interesting point from this slide is that despite the fact in the Northwest you have up to 30 more days to conduct your hunt, it's not translating into more hunting effort on average. Okay? So maybe we can get a sense as to why that's the case by taking a look at the distribution of when people are saying that they're actually conducting their hunts. So here we asked, did you hunt in any particular week starting from September 15th right through to December 15th? Here's the folks that were hunting in the Northwest. So you get a little bit of an uptake early on. Some of the northern units, the gun season starts on September 15th. There's also the bow hunt opportunities. But it's really that gun hunt opener on October 6th in 2012 that pulled in the vast majority of individuals. And you can see for the first 2 weeks, it's pretty busy out there and sort of declines off. And then, but it maintains itself even into later through in December. And we contrast that with the Northeast. you can see that the northeast hunt tends to be a little bit busier in the first 3 weeks of the gun hunt season. Okay? And then, of course, it essentially stops after November 15th. The reason that it's not zero after November 15th is some of these individuals may have gone on to some of the units in the Northwest and conducted some hunting. And then, of course, in Southern Ontario, a 6-day gun hunt. It happened to coincide with 2 of the weeks that we had with our survey here, so that's why it looks like this in terms of the distribution. And overall, the Ontario description is probably not a good description of any of these particular groups, but that's what sort of the average would look like if we put them all together. So one of the complicating factors you can imagine when you're looking at something like the timing of hunt and effort of hunt is whether people are essentially locals or non-locals to the area where they hunt. Well, we define locals as individuals who live in the same region where they conduct their hunt, and non-locals obviously being people who are living in other regions. If we break it down across the 3 MNRF regions, you can see that Southern Ontario is essentially a local hunt. 95% of the individuals out there are locals. In the Northeast, it's closer to a 50-50 split, a slight favor towards locals. And in the Northwest, we can see that it's much more focused on non-locals. Okay, so that gives us an insight that there are some differences between these regions. So let's go back and take a look at that effort graph, and I'm just going to look at it between the Northwest and the Northeast, locals and non-locals. So the Northwest locals on average are spending about 12 days hunting. It's about the same for the Northeast locals, and the Northwest non-locals, it's about 7.5, and it's the same for the Northeast non-locals. Again, despite the fact you have an extra 30 days of hunt in the Northwest, it's not translating into more hunting effort on average. Okay. So let's look at the timing by these different groups, because I think it's pretty instructive as well. So if we look at the Northeast locals, you can see that they're piling up the first 3 weeks of the gun hunt season, and a little bit with the 2 weeks following that. But and they maintain the hunt even towards the November 15th timeline. If we look at the non-locals, you can see that it's really a 2-week hunt period, and after 4 weeks, there are essentially no non-locals left hunting in northeastern Ontario. The Northwest locals, you can see the first 2 weeks are particularly important. You can also see that there's a big surge late in the season. There's a lot of locals in the Northwest region that focus on a snow hunt. Okay? But that's not translating into extra days of hunting. Okay? So the intensity of the hunt is probably a little bit lighter over all those different weeks by the folks in the Northwest. And the Northwest non-locals, it's really that first week that matters, and after that it tails off pretty quickly. One of the questions that we asked moose hunters in 2013 was, how many moose have you personally harvested in your lifetime? And another question we asked was, how many years have you actively hunted for moose? So what we did was we took the number of years that a person actively hunted for moose and divided it by the number of moose that were harvested. And that would give us, on average, how many years it would take to harvest a moose in the different regions. And so if you look in the Northwest, on average, it takes about 4.5 hunting seasons to personally harvest a moose. That goes up to 8 for the Northeast and almost 11 in Southern. And there are differences in group size. I'll acknowledge that between these 3 regions, but it doesn't correct for the fact that the hunting success is higher in the Northwest, followed by the Northeast, followed by Southern. Just one quick slide looking at the method of hunting. In this case, what I really want to focus on is the fact of the organized drives with other hunters. In Southern Ontario, that's used much more than it is in the northern parts of the province, and that's no doubt because of the history of the deer hunt and the larger party size in Southern Ontario. And as well, you can see that calling is higher in the Northwest and Northeast regions. All right. This slide in some ways is a little bit unfair in terms of the comparison because the questions were asked a little bit differently. For the 2001 survey, the question was, how do you communicate with your hunting party? And in 2012, the survey focused on, well, you're on your hunting trip, what types of communications do you use? So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. But the point is, over the 11-year period, we went from about 25% of the people indicating that they were using cell phone or two-way radios to something that's 75 to 80%. So the point is that the hunt is changing as a result of technology, and we always have to keep our eye on the way that people are creative, and they should be creative in terms of their use of technology, but we want to be aware of how that might translate into changing levels of success. So it's one thing that we always have to try to keep our eyes on. Okay, final part of this description of the moose hunter. So we're going to look at expenditures, and these are trip-related expenditures, so things like food and fuel and accommodation. So they're averaged out by the different types of hunters, and we have our Northwest locals, Northeast locals, Northwest non-locals, Northeast non-locals, Southern Ontario folks, and Ontario. If you look across Ontario, on average, the trip-related expenditures are about $1,000. Okay? And that varies a bit. In Southern region, it's a little bit lower. Well, they're spending fewer days hunting, right? For the non-locals, it's higher in Northwest and even for Northeast. And that's particularly important because this is new money that comes into the area. I don't think a lot of people would have just taken a trip into Northern Ontario in October and spent $1,400 looking at some other activity. So it's an important component for these local economies. And if you want to start doing some math around this, well, I can do this math. It's about $1,000 for the average hunter. You estimate there's about 87,000 active hunters out there. Translates into about $87 million in expenditures in 2012. That does not include gear and equipment purchases. Okay? So people buy trucks and ATVs and rifles that are wholly or partially attributable to the activity of moose hunting. And our best guess, and I emphasize guess, about those types of expenditures is about $1,400 per active hunter. So if you roll that all up, you can make the argument that moose hunters in 2012 spent about $200 million in the province of Ontario. All right, so let's talk a little about these moose harvest strategy options. And I just want to remind you of a few points here. One, these surveys were conducted in the spring of 2013 that I'm going to focus on. That was before the moose aerial inventory showed declines in some of the wildlife management units. That was before there was changes to the adult validation tags in those units in 2014. That was before the engagement opportunities that were made available through the Moose Project, and it was before the EBR posting. This was all predates that work. And in fact, the work that we had conducted at the time was part of what was known as a pre-engagement activity for the Moose Project to provide some of the insights internally about the way that hunters were supporting or not supporting different types of harvest strategy options, and as well to communicate those results to focus groups that were held, which many of the individuals around the audience I know attended this last fall around the Moose Project. So this was one question that we had from the 2012 survey, and it was a very simple question. It was, think about the WMU where you conducted your hunt most often in the year. Would you accept more restrictive regulations in that unit? Okay? And I've netted out the unsure response. There's about 20% of people who say, I don't know. But those people that were sure in the Northwest, about 80% said, no, I don't want to see more restrictive regulations. Northeast, 90%, Southern, 95%. The reason that I want to show you this slide is because these values change depending on how you ask the question. And it's pretty important to understand the context. But remember this point. It's about 80% for Northwest, 90% for Northeast in terms of opposition to these types of changes. So I'm going to draw results from two other questions, one which was asked from the provincial Moose Hunter survey, and it provided sort of a general description of harvest strategy options, and I'll show you them on the next slide, and sort of a general description as to what would be the benefits of adopting those types of harvest strategy options. And then in the Northeast region, there were really much more specific in terms of what those options would be, and specific in terms of the benefits, and those benefits would be communicated in terms of potential changes to the number of adult validation tags that would become available. And that was based off of the expert advice from our Northeast regional wildlife biologist. So he was sort of the one instrumental for that work. So what do these harvest strategy options look like? Well, they both had a status quo. Just keep everything the way it is. They both had end season earlier, but you can see the difference in specificity here. When you go to the Northeast survey, it's end the season on October 31st, or it's having a 14-day gun hunt, 14-day bow hunt. Okay. They both had calf validation tag system. They both had shortened season for calves. And again, look at the specificity for the Northeast survey option. 21, 22-day gun, bow hunt, 6-day calf hunt. So that was what was asked. There was also, in the provincial survey, we asked about beginning the season later, splitting the gun season into 2 separate seasons, and reducing adult validation tags, which is really the only lever that we have available at this time. So we asked people to rank those items. In the case of the provincial survey, from 1 to 7, using each rank only once. And in the case of the Northeast survey, from 1 to 5, using each rank only once. Well, it's cognitively challenging for people to rank, or people just don't like ranking things. So what happens is the dark green pie slice corresponds with the percentage of respondents who correctly, and when I say correctly rank the responses, I mean they only used each rank once. The light green pie slice indicates that people blended some sort of rating system. But we're able to recover their ranks. So for example, if they said 2 different options were their most preferred, we could give them both a rank of 1.5. And then the red pie are people that either did not fill out that question or filled it out in a way that we couldn't make the results comparable. The main point of this slide is to say that I'm going to focus all the responses later from those from the dark green and light green slices, and when I did comparisons to see if there are differences between those individuals from those 2 pie slices, there really isn't. Okay? So they're essentially the same, and that's the group that we're going to go forward with. So here's the average ranks for our 7 options, where a rank of 1 is most preferred and a rank of 7 is least preferred. You'll notice that Southern Ontario is not on the list here. I didn't include it in the presentation because it doesn't make a lot of sense to split a gun hunting season that's only 6 days long, right, and those types of options. But we do have the Northwest and Northeast responses, and so what's the number 1 response? It's keep everything the same, okay, and that's consistent with what we heard in the previous question. What are the next 2 options? Shorten the calf season, end the season earlier. What are the worst 2 options? Implementing a calf tag system, reducing the number of ABTs. Okay, so this is one way to describe those results, but you can also look at it through a full disclosure of the ranks. And so here, the dark green areas are the percentage of individuals who said that was their most preferred option. The dark brown bar is the percentage of individuals saying that's their least preferred option. So when we look at status quo, we'll see that it's around 55% for hunters in the Northwest region. But I told you it was 80% earlier. Okay? So as soon as you start adding details, that support for that status quo starts to move away a bit. The shortened calf season, end season earlier, you can see that it's not like everyone's overwhelmingly supportive of those 2 options, but compared to the rest of the menu, they're not as bad as a lot of the other ones. Okay? So that's why they're ranking up so high. And on the far side, I'll just point out the calf validation tag system. Lots of people really like that, really hate that idea, but 1/3 of individuals saying it's one of the 2 worst things to do. We also had about 1/4 of people saying it's one of the best 2 things to do. So it's a really polarizing option. Some people really like it, some people really hate it. And then reducing adult validation tags is at the lowest. So if we go from the Northwest to the Northeast, you'll see, if I can animate this a bit, you'll see that the status quo support actually declines. The reduction, there's a reduction in terms of calf validation tags and in terms of the AVTs. So there's less support there. So now, remember I said there was about 90% support or support for the status quo by the hunters in Northeast region. Now we're down to about 50%. So let's go to the 3rd survey, which is the Northeast Region Moose Hunter Survey. Rank of 1, most preferred. Rank of 5, least preferred. And for the resident hunters, there's essentially a tie for the top 2 options, which are shorten the gun season by 15 days to October 31st, or to put in a 21 to 22-day gun/bow season with a 6-day calf hunt, followed by the calf tag validation system, followed by the status quo, followed by the 14-day gun and archery season. Okay? And we'll take a look at the full ranks in a moment. The other thing I want to demonstrate on this slide is there's the differences between the tourism operators and the resident hunters. What are those differences? Well, tourism operators are more supportive of anything that would restrict calf harvest. So the 6-day calf hunt and the calf tag validation system, they're more supportive, and they're less supportive of the status quo. So that's the differences between those two groups. So if we look at it in terms of the full ranks, again, dark green being most preferred option, dark brown being the least preferred option, you can see that there's not a lot to choose from when you just look at it in terms of most preferred. But the insights really come in when you look at the opposite end of the spectrum. In terms of being least preferred, this shortening of the gun season by 15 days or this implementation of a shortened calf season have less opposition than you do for the other options. Interestingly enough, status quo now has got a preference of about 20%. So we started at 90, we went to 50. Now, through the specificity that's added with this question, as well as potential benefits of taking on those other options in terms of future AVTs, that support for that status quo is sort of faded away. So compare that to the tourism operators. Again, there's just an increased preference around the idea of these systems that would affect calf harvest in terms of the shortened calf tag season and shortened calf season and calf tag validation system, both being more preferable, and the status quo being less preferable. All right. So we asked hunters too, if we implemented the following options in the WMU where you hunted most often in 2012, what would you do? And so the options that hunters could tell us was that they would stay in the same unit, they would move to another unit, they would quit moose hunting, or I don't know what I would do. And if you look here in terms of the stated or these intended behaviors, you can see that the shortened calf season and end season earlier, the red bars, those quits, are at much lower level than for the other options. And in fact, the calf validation tags and reduced AVTs are at the higher end. If we look at it for the northeast, so this was the northwest hunt, in the northeast, you can see those red bars grow. There's a lot more people on the edge, I would say, in the northeast of whether they want to continue on with this activity or not. So that's being reflected in that increase in those red bars. But again, it's really the calf validation tag system and it's the reduction in AVTs that are driving what people are saying they are really concerned about going on with this activity. Okay, so that's what people tell us though, right? It's not actually what they do. So they're telling us they would quit, but if that happened, they really wouldn't do that. Well, remember that we conducted the survey in 2013 before we had affected wildlife management units with reduced tags. So we can actually take a look now and say, hey, there was a reduction in adult validation tags in some of the units. What did people actually do? So how do we estimate the sort of quit rate? Well, we can do that in one of two ways. We can compare the license sales from 2014 to 2013, or we can compare the number of Choice 1 applicants in the draw from 2014 to 2013. So that gives us our truth in terms of how many people left the activity of moose hunting. Now, how do we predict who would have left? Well, first we have to identify affected wildlife management units. So arbitrarily, and this is arbitrarily, I chose that a 10% decline in the number of adult validation tags from 2013 to 2014 would mean that it was an affected unit. So then we take all those people in 2013 who had selected those units as their Choice 1 WMU and multiply them by the rate that was expected in terms of quit. So for the Northeast region, it was about 18.9%. I also accounted for the fact of the unsure responses in two ways. One, I just said none of them would quit, and on the other side I said they would quit at the same rate that we observed with all the other people who were sure about their responses. Okay? So that was how we got the quit rate. We also looked at the quit and move. To get the actual data, again, we had to identify the affected WMUs. And from those affected WMUs, we compared the number of Choice 1 applicants to those WMUs in 2013 to 2014 to take a look at the decline. And we compared, and the prediction was basically done the same way as I described already. So what did we find? Well, there were about 6,000 fewer license sales in 2014 than 2013. Okay, and that corresponded to about the same number in terms of change to the number of Choice 1 applicants. What were our predictions? The predictions were that at the low end there'd be about 7,000 fewer hunters, and at the high end there'd be about 10,000 fewer hunters. So the BS factor, so to speak, would be about 20 to 70% in terms of the hunters that were telling us that we're going to quit that actually seemed to quit. So that's sort of the matching of what was stated to what was actually done. In terms of the quit and move, we had about 9,500 fewer hunters apply to the affected wildlife management units in 2014 than in 2013. Okay? And our predictions were that there should have been about 15 to 21,000 fewer applicants. So you can see that if you want to call it that BS factor, it's higher when you start accounting for that move of the hunter. So it seems like the quit rate, there is some inflation, and when you talk about the quit and move, there's a higher rate of inflation. But if we know that in advance, we can actually control for it and calibrate all the different results. All right, so let's get to some different conclusions here. One, there's a diversity of hunters. That's not a surprising message. There's a large number of female hunters, so that 11% of the population that's hunting that are females, that corresponds to about 11,000 hunters, right? There are hunters of all different age demographics. There are hunters with different preferences in terms of hunting methods, in terms of hunting styles, time of the year to hunt, focus on particular demographics of moose. There are different skills out there. The reason I bring this all up to you is that when you have a heterogeneous population like this, it's really hard to provide a characteristic voice for that entire group. And so what I would argue is that these types of social surveys are particularly helpful in describing that heterogeneity and in terms of the types of voices that you hear. So conclusion number one, cynically speaking, I'm sure that you folks have figured this out, the research scientist is telling us that we need to do more research of a similar vein. Okay. Number two, there's an economic importance associated with moose hunting. And that economic importance is, to me, relevant when the hunting is done by non-locals. So if an individual is in Thunder Bay and they quit moose hunting but pick up bowling, they're still spending money within that community, right? So the economic impact may not be that large. But when you have people who are traveling into an area for that activity of moose hunting and spending money in those local economies, they're probably not going to be doing that if they are not hunting for moose anymore. So the opportunities in Northern Ontario of having so many people from Southern Ontario come in and spend money really contributes to the economic well-being of people in Northern Ontario. Number three, yeah, the status quo. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? If you ask the question one way, you get a really strong response in terms of people saying, absolutely, I'm going to stay with the status quo. And if you start chiseling away at it, you can find that the support for status quo can actually drop. It's actually explainable in terms of psychology, in terms of the way that people tend to be risk averse, and people tend to consider losses worse than the benefits of a gain. Or in other words, it's a lot worse for you to lose $20 than the benefit it is to find $20, so to speak. So what happens is people tend to get stuck with the status quo. But remember with the way that I ask these questions, the status quo is just keeping everything the same. If status quo means that we're going to reduce adult validation tags, it's not really that much of a preferable option. So what other options are available if we have to do something? Well, it seems that the reduction to the seasons in terms of the overall length, shortening the season, or even the shortening of the calf season were showing up as the more preferable options for the hunters. And the final part is that the intentions and the actual behaviors are slightly disconnected, but they're reasonably well related so that we can actually use what people are telling us they would do as a good predictor for what they actually do. And I think that's really important because it can provide us with opportunities to look forward in terms of how people might react to different types of management approaches that we have available. And the final slide here, I just want to thank those individuals who actually responded to all these different surveys. Without your responses, obviously we have no data, we have no information, so it's critically important that we get those responses. I want to highlight as well our Northeast Regional Wildlife Biologist, Peter Davis, who was instrumental in terms of setting up everything around that Northeast Moose Hunter Survey, and Patrick Hubert from our Wildlife Policy section, who was a champion to make sure that we had this provincial Moose Hunter Survey conducted, and then a number of other individuals as well. So I think I'll stop here.
So I think we do actually have a few minutes here to ask questions. So if anyone has any questions for Len, please step up to the mics.
Yes, I'm Roy Polsky. I'm from Balcarron. I was one of the recipients for the provincial survey and the other survey, Northeast Survey, and I also did attend the Moose Focus meeting. The way that a lot of these questions were asked in regards to, I can understand why you're getting these results from your surveys, because basically most of these questions I found that they sort of like basically went in regards to looking for a calf season or calf validation tags, and that's why I can understand these results. But then, having been at the focus meeting and seeing the results from the group over there, so I'm just trying to wonder, was the ministry at the same meeting I was? Because I don't recall ever having a 2-week calf season that was ever mentioned at that time. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to comment upon how we arrived at the EBR posting that we have right now. And I was at those focus group sessions, as you're aware. And I think it's best to try to follow up with our wildlife policy section folks and try to get an answer as to why there's a seeming disconnect between what was discussed at those meetings and what we have in front of us now. But you can imagine it's a negotiated process in terms of policy development, so it's never as straightforward or simple as one hopes. Essentially.
So can I just jump in here for a second? So that's a good reminder that, as I said this morning, I think the important thing to remember is that, you know, Len has certain expertise, and his expertise is on the social side of things, talking about moose hunters, who moose hunters are, and the results of the surveys. And I know that it's a polarizing issue right now, and we're all talking about the Moose Project, and we're talking about policy changes, and we're talking about tag reductions, and we're talking about a lot of things related to moose. But that's not necessarily why Len's here today. So just make sure when you're asking your questions that you keep them within the scope of the presentation that he gave. And we can talk about some of those other things after if you want to chat with myself or our senior wildlife biologist, Mark Rickman. Robin?
Hello, Len. Robin Horwath, member. I don't know my zone, but I've been a member since 1981. My question is, with your graphs, last year with the changes that were made, there was 6,000 less licenses sold. That's $360,000 to the SBA account. That's $6 million in money spent on trips by hunters and another over $6 million in equipment. Do you have a prediction with the changes that are projected now or suggested in the EBR, what that's going to cost to the economy and the SBA account?
And that's a very good question. I do not have those projections at hand. I think there's two components that you have to think about with these types of projections. One, there will be an effect. But the question is whether that effect is different from our sort of current path right now, which would lead us to potentially have further reductions to ABTs. And from what I see in terms of the results, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that the path that we're on right now would be all that more detrimental than a path where we would have serious reductions to ABTs in a number of units. So, and I think that's why in the EBR posting there was a description of the social and economic implications associated with the proposed policy being essentially neutral. So I believe that's where it came from, although I'd have to check with our folks to make sure. Yeah.
Thank
Hi, Len. It's Glen Rehberg from a little place called Murillo, not far from you. Just an observation, and based on your work, which is excellent, between 2013 and 2014, the number of hunters that quit or moved, I would suggest that the true number, which is going to be very hard to tweak out if there's more changes, but the true number might have been between 2013 and 2015, because in 2014, I know just from anecdotally, a lot of hunters didn't fully realize the impacts of what the changes were.
Yeah, and that's a good observation as well, that sometimes there's a lag, a time lag between a policy change and the way that people react to that policy change. And you're right, looking ahead to 2015, depending on where we're at in terms of where we're at in terms of moose management, would be highly instructive in terms of trying to understand what the implications of some of the previous changes were.
Doug Howden, Halton Sportsman Association. I'll be putting in my tag this year, even though I don't plan to hunt the 2015 season, but in order to stay eligible for Pool 1 in 2016. Is there any way that you can figure out what percentage of people do that? Like I don't know that I'm going to hunt this year. If I draw a tag, obviously I will be. Yeah. But I've got to keep my options open for next year.
Yes, there are ways to try to figure that out. We have, on an annual basis, we have moose hunter postcard surveys that are sent out to individuals who are successful in the draw, but as well a random sample of individuals who are not successful in the draw, and that gives us an indication as to whether that individual pursued the activity of moose hunting that particular year. But it could change as well in the future. Like the rate that I was talking about in terms of about 17% seems to be consistent with what we're seeing from the moose hunter postcard survey. So whether that changes, whether it goes up in the future or not, I guess is an empirical question that we'll find out.
Like what I'm looking at is, I hunt with about 10, 12 guys that deer hunt. 6 to 8 of us put in for a moose tag. But if we don't get a tag, we don't go moose hunting. So that really skews your numbers as far as there's $1,400 or $1,000 we're not all spending on moose hunting that year.
Yeah, and again, I tried to work that in terms of the survey by asking questions about how many days an individual hunted in 2012. So obviously if they didn't hunt during that year, they would have been considered an inactive hunter, and so they wouldn't have been included in terms of when I rolled up all that data. Getting a precise estimate as to the percentage of individuals that are inactive is challenging, though. I will acknowledge that.
Okay, thanks, Len.
Yeah.
Hello, Dave from Zone J, Kitchener. I hunt moose with a very large gang. I believe we're typically 28 people in camp. We own about 1,000 acres of land. I'm just wondering if you've looked at the impact of a lot of the camps when you say people are looking at the feasibility of moving from one zone to another. We don't have that option. We can't take our 1,000 acres of land and move to a different zone. We're stuck where we are. We're a large taxpayer in the region that we hunt, and our options are getting pretty narrow for moose hunting. So, it's going to get to the point we're going to shut down the moose camp and become a deer camp. So I don't know if you've looked at the impact economic of that.
We haven't. It is, again, a good point that individuals are often dependent or attached to particular areas for hunting, and for a variety of reasons may not want to move away from their traditional areas for hunting. And that can lead to essentially a dichotomous decision. Either I hunt in the unit where I always hunt, or I decide to withdraw my hunting activity. So it is a good point.
Good morning, Len. My name is Rob Hare. I'm a chairman of Zone G. I come from the thriving metropolis of Keswick. Len, my question to you is, you have some very good statistical data. Have you ever been approached, or can you make this data available to the outfitter associations? Obviously, for them, it would be a key indicator of their target group of people that they need to approach and a lot of these people in this room probably fall into that category. So to make the hunts more accessible and more attractive, would they be able to access that information so they know their target group of people to approach?
And yes, we can make that information available, and we will. I'll make contact over to the NOTO folks and make sure that they have an opportunity to get a copy of the report that was done. And as you know, during the moose hunt focus groups, there were tourism representatives at those groups as well that would have heard similar presentation. Again, we do have a copy of the 2012 Provincial Moose Hunter Survey available for folks. I do have a few copies around, and if you'd like a copy, if I run out, just drop me a line, leave me your email, whatever. I can send you a PDF or a hard copy.
Yeah, so I think these will be the last two questions here, and then we're running into our coffee break. So.
Okay. Len, that was a very good presentation. I'm Dave Featherstone from Tavistock Rod and Gun. We see that your presentation has people, and it's for moose hunting, so you have moose and you have people. Is there a one-stop shop where you can see the moose population effect in numbers, along with your charts with the people that you're showing in the different areas of hunting?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking for.
Your surveys show decline in moose hunters. So that's one side of the page. The other side of the page is the moose. How does that correlate with the moose population?
Well, the units that were affected by the ABT reductions for 2014, the moose aerial inventories would have indicated that there was a decline to those populations. So that was the reason that precipitated the type of reduction to ABTs. So I guess the information is available. They are linked in that way. They are.
Yeah, it would be nice just to see if there was like a
Sure.
one-pager where you could see the result of the decline of adult validation tags, which declines the hunters. Does the moose population actually increase?
That's a good point. I'll bring it forward to our wildlife policy section. Yeah, thanks.
Good morning. Tony Jackson from Zone J. A couple quick questions, I guess. Speaking of the BS factor, certainly the 6,000 doesn't seem to represent the people who have actually quit. As one person has commented, people just didn't go, which was a loss. But we have a lot of hunters that feel they are held hostage by the Pool 1, Pool 2 scenario. So you have to buy a license in hope that next year maybe the system will change or there will be consideration. But when you speak of 6,000 people quit, I think an important factor to try to determine is what is the future impact to new hunters or the new cohorts that might be coming into the system. Of the 6,000 people that quit, how many new hunters won't be introduced to moose hunting or have that opportunity? And what does that really mean in the big scheme of things? You have people drop off at the end, you have people coming on at the start. So what does that 6,000 really mean? And also in combination with that, how many bear and wolf licenses were not sold to those 6,000 hunters and the other 6,000 hunters that just didn't go? So what is the total impact on the resource? And my last question is, will there be future surveys? What will you do to get better response rates and questions that are more accurately responded to and appropriately answered?
Maybe I'll start with the third question first, because it's probably the simplest one for me to respond to. We don't have any plans at this time to conduct another social survey of moose hunters. Obviously, moose hunting is an important activity to MNRF, and the interest that we saw around the moose project would tell me that at some point in the future there would be an interest to surveying moose hunters again. There is the postcard survey that's conducted on an annual basis. In terms of the implications of a loss of a number of individuals from the moose hunt on a wider population level effect to moose hunting, again, you know, I'll concede the point. It's a really good point. We don't have the analysis, we don't have that data to understand how those 6,000 individuals who are not hunting, and maybe many others who as you say, are applying to the draw because they want to maintain their priority status. How that would implicate or impact the future participation in hunting among the youth. But that is a really good question to explore. Yeah. Okay.
All right, well, those are great questions, and I think we all know that over the next year and coming years, we're going to be talking about moose and the Moose Project at length. And I just want to thank Dr. Len Hunt again for coming out at a time when moose is top of mind and when we all have a lot of questions about moose, and to present on an important aspect looking at the hunter and looking at the socioeconomics is something that we look to all the time. So again, please join me in thanking Dr. Len Hunt.